Dr. Carlson kicks a black boy named Trevor out of the emergency room. But 7 minutes later, a horrifying incident changes everything, and he gets a brutal revenge. How will this incident affect Dr. Carlson's life as he faces his downfall? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The emergency room at St. Mary's Hospital buzzed with activity. Nurses rushed back and forth, their shoes squeaking on the polished floor. Patients sat in uncomfortable chairs, some holding ice packs to their heads, others cradling injured arms. The air was thick with worry and pain. In the middle of it all stood Dr. Carlson, his white coat crisp despite the chaos around him. He moved from patient to patient with quick, efficient steps. His face was set in a stern expression, eyes sharp behind his glasses. "Next," he called out, not looking up from the chart in his hands. An elderly woman hobbled forward, leaning heavily on her cane. "Doctor, I've been waiting for hours," she said, her voice quavering. Dr. Carlson barely glanced at her. "What seems to be the problem?" "My chest, it feels tight, I can't catch my breath," she wheezed. He nodded briskly. "Nurse, get her set up for an ECG. I'll be back to check on you later." With that, he turned away, already focused on the next patient. A young man with a gash on his forehead approached. "Doc, I think I need stitches," he said, wincing as he spoke. Dr. Carlson examined the wound quickly. "You'll live. Clean it up and put some butterfly bandages on it," he instructed a nearby nurse. "Next." As the day wore on, Dr. Carlson moved through the ER like a well-oiled machine. He barked orders, made quick diagnoses, and kept things moving. But there was something missing in his interactions. A warmth, a human touch. A child crying in the corner barely registered with him. A worried husband pacing by his wife's bedside was just another obstacle to navigate around. Dr. Carlson was doing his job, and doing it well, but the compassion that had once drawn him to medicine seemed to have faded away. As the sun began to set outside the hospital windows, a nurse approached Dr. Carlson. "Doctor, we have a patient complaining of severe abdominal pain. She's been waiting for a while." Dr. Carlson sighed, rubbing his eyes tiredly. "How long?" "About 3 hours," the nurse replied hesitantly. He frowned. "Why wasn't I notified earlier? Never mind. Where is she?" The nurse led him to a curtained-off area where a young woman lay curled up on a bed, her face etched with pain. Dr. Carlson approached, his mind already racing through possible diagnoses. "I'm Dr. Carlson," he said, his voice clipped and professional. "Tell me about your symptoms." As the woman began to speak, Dr. Carlson listened with half an ear, his eyes scanning her chart. He was efficient, thorough, and completely detached. To him, she wasn't a person in pain. She was just another case to solve, another problem to fix before he could move on to the next one. The emergency room doors slid open with a hiss and Marla burst in, half carrying her 9-year-old nephew Trevor. The boy's face was pale, his eyes unfocused. A nasty bruise was forming on his forehead. "Please, we need help," Marla called out, her voice trembling with worry. She approached the front desk, supporting Trevor with one arm. "My nephew fell at the playground. I think he might have a concussion." The receptionist looked up, her eyes widening at the sight of the boy. "Okay, ma'am. Let me get you checked in. What's the patient's name?" "Trevor," Marla replied, her words coming out in a rush. "Trevor Williams. Please, he needs to see a doctor right away. He's been throwing up and he's really dizzy." The receptionist typed quickly into her computer. "All right, I've got him registered. Dr. Carlson is on call tonight. Please have a seat, and we'll get to you as soon as we can." Marla's face fell. But he needs help now. Can't you see how bad he looks?" Trevor leaned heavily against his aunt, his eyes half closed. "Aunt Marla," he mumbled. "I don't feel good." "I know, sweetie," Marla said softly, stroking his hair. She turned back to the receptionist, her voice rising. "Please, isn't there anything you can do? He's just a little boy." Other patients in the waiting room looked over, some with sympathy, others with annoyance at the commotion. Marla felt tears of frustration welling up in her eyes. Just then, Dr. Carlson strode past, his white coat flapping behind him. Marla's eyes lit up with hope. "Doctor," she called out. "Please, my nephew needs help. We think he has a concussion." Dr. Carlson paused, turning to look at them. His eyes swept over Trevor, taking in the bruise, the pallor of his skin. But instead of the concern Marla expected, she saw only impatience in the doctor's face. "Ma'am," Dr. Carlson said, his tone curt, "if it's just a bump on the head, I suggest you take him to the walk-in clinic down the street. We have more pressing cases here." Marla's mouth fell open in shock. But he's been throwing up. He can barely keep his eyes open. Please, can't you just take a quick look at him?" Dr. Carlson shook his head. "The clinic can handle minor injuries. If it gets worse, you can come back." With that, he turned and walked away, already focused on his next task. Marla stood there, stunned. She looked down at Trevor, who was leaning more heavily against her now, his eyes closed. Fear and anger battled within her. How could a doctor be so dismissive? Marla's heart raced as she watched Dr. Carlson walk away. She couldn't believe what was happening. With Trevor growing heavier in her arms, she made a split-second decision. She wasn't going to let this go. "Doctor," she called out, her voice echoing through the busy emergency room. "Please, wait." The doctor stopped and turned, his face a mask of irritation. "Ma'am, I've already told you." "No, you listen to me," Marla interrupted, her voice shaking with a mix of fear and anger. "Trevor isn't just bumped his head. He's getting worse by the minute. Look at him." As if on cue, Trevor's knees buckled. Marla struggled to keep him upright, her eyes pleading with the doctor. Dr. Carlson sighed heavily. "I understand you're concerned, but nothing," Marla shot back. "We have nowhere else to go. The clinic is closed at this hour. Please, I'm begging you, just take a look at him." The doctor's impatience was palpable. He glanced at his watch, then back at Marla and Trevor. "Ma'am, I have patients with life-threatening conditions waiting. Your nephew's condition, while unfortunate, is simply not critical enough to be prioritized right now." Marla felt her face grow hot with anger and embarrassment. She was aware of the eyes of other patients and staff members on them. Not critical enough? He can barely stand. Dr. Carlson's tone became condescending. "People like you always tend to exaggerate. A little bump and bruise, and suddenly it's a medical emergency." His words hung in the air, shocking in their callousness. Nearby, a nurse's eyes widened, and she exchanged a worried glance with a colleague. An elderly patient in a wheelchair shook his head disapprovingly. "People like me?" Marla repeated, her voice low and dangerous. "What exactly do you mean by that, doctor?" Dr. Carlson seemed to realize he'd crossed a line. He backpedaled, but his tone remained dismissive. "I simply mean that parents and guardians often overreact. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have actual emergencies to attend to." As he turned to leave again, Marla felt a surge of desperation. "We're not leaving until Trevor gets help," she declared, loud enough for everyone to hear. "If anything happens to him because you refuse to help, it's on you, doctor." The emergency room had grown quieter, the tension palpable. Staff members whispered among themselves, some looking uncomfortable, others outright disapproving of Dr. Carlson's behavior. Marla's heart sank as she watched Dr. Carlson turn his back on them once again. Tears of frustration and fear welled up in her eyes. She looked down at Trevor, who was leaning heavily against her, his eyes unfocused and his skin clammy. "Come on, baby," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We'll find help somewhere else." With a heavy heart, Marla began to guide Trevor towards the exit. Each step felt like a mile as she supported her nephew's weight. The busy sounds of the emergency room faded behind them as they neared the lobby. Suddenly, Trevor's body went rigid. His eyes rolled back, and before Marla could react, he collapsed to the floor. "Trevor!" Marla screamed, her voice filled with terror. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands hovering helplessly over his shaking body. "Someone help! Please, help us!" The lobby erupted into chaos. People gasped and moved away, creating a circle around Trevor and Marla. A security guard rushed over, speaking urgently into his radio. Marla's screams echoed through the waiting area, drawing the attention of everyone nearby. Nurses at the front desk sprang into action, rushing towards them with worried expressions. Dr. Carlson, who had been walking away, froze at the sound of Marla's desperate cries. He turned slowly, his face pale as he took in the scene unfolding in the lobby. As Trevor continued to seize on the floor, another doctor, a woman with kind eyes and quick movements, pushed through the gathering crowd. She knelt beside Trevor, immediately assessing the situation. "I need a gurney here, stat," she called out, her voice calm but urgent. "And page neurology." A nurse appeared at her side, already on the phone. "Code blue in the lobby," she reported. "We need an emergency response team immediately." Marla watched in horror as Trevor's small body convulsed on the cold hospital floor. She couldn't stop the tears that flowed down her cheeks. "Please," she begged, looking from the new doctor to the frozen Dr. Carlson. "Please help him." The kind-eyed doctor placed a gentle hand on Marla's shoulder. "We're going to take good care of him," she assured her. "Can you tell me what happened?" As Marla recounted Trevor's fall and their experience in the emergency room, she noticed Dr. Carlson's face grow even paler. He stood rooted to the spot, watching as his colleagues worked to stabilize Trevor. Minutes after Trevor's collapse, the emergency room was in a frenzy. Doctors and nurses rushed around, working to stabilize the young boy. Marla stood nearby, her face streaked with tears, watching helplessly as medical staff fought to save her nephew's life. Amidst the chaos, a bystander named Tina, who had witnessed the entire ordeal, held up her cell phone. Her hand shook as she recorded the scene, capturing not only the current emergency, but also Dr. Carlson's earlier dismissive behavior towards Trevor and Marla. Tina's heart raced as she hit the post button on her social media account. She added a brief, emotional caption. "Doctor refuses to help sick child. This is not okay." Within 7 minutes, the video began to spread like wildfire. People shared it with shocked comments and angry reactions. By the time an hour had passed, the footage had gone viral, reaching thousands of viewers across the country. The public's response was swift and fierce. Comments flooded in, condemning Dr. Carlson's actions and the hospital's apparent lack of oversight. "How could a doctor turn away a sick child?" one user wrote. Another commented, "This is blatant discrimination. That doctor should lose his license." The outrage grew with each passing hour. News outlets picked up the story, running it as a headline. "Doctor's neglect caught on camera. Child collapses in hospital lobby." As the story gained traction, the hospital's phone lines lit up with calls from concerned citizens and reporters seeking answers. The pressure mounted, and the hospital's PR team scrambled to formulate a response. In his office, the hospital's chief administrator, Dr. Evelyn Marsh, watched the video with a grim expression. She rubbed her temples, feeling a headache coming on. This was a disaster, and she knew immediate action was necessary. With a heavy sigh, Dr. Marsh picked up her phone and dialed Dr. Carlson's extension. "Dr. Carlson," she said, her voice tense, "I need you in my office immediately. We have an urgent situation to discuss." Dr. Carlson arrived at Dr. Marsh's office, his face pale and drawn. As he entered, he could feel the weight of her disapproving gaze. "Sit down, Dr. Carlson," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "We need to talk about what happened today." Dr. Carlson sat stiffly in the chair, his eyes fixed on Dr. Marsh's stern face. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a scalpel. "Dr. Carlson," Dr. Marsh began, her voice heavy with disappointment, "I've just watched a video that shows you turning away a child in need of urgent care. Can you explain your actions?" Dr. Carlson shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Dr. Marsh, you have to understand. The ER was packed. We had serious cases coming in left and right. I made a judgment call based on what I saw at the time." Dr. Marsh's eyes narrowed. "A judgment call that nearly cost a child his life," she said sharply. "Dr. Carlson, let me remind you of something fundamental. A doctor's duty is to treat every patient with care and respect, regardless of our assumptions or frustrations." Dr. Carlson's face flushed. He leaned forward, his voice rising. "But the conditions in the ER..." are not an excuse. Dr. Marsh cut him off firmly. We're always busy, always under pressure. That doesn't give us the right to dismiss a patient without proper examination. She stood up, pacing behind her desk. Do you understand the gravity of this situation? That video is everywhere. People are outraged, and rightly so. Your actions have not only endangered a child, but have also damaged the reputation of this hospital. Dr. Carlson's shoulders slumped. The weight of his actions was finally sinking in. What happens now? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Marsh sat back down, her expression grim. Effective immediately. You're suspended pending a formal investigation. We'll be reviewing your past cases, speaking with your colleagues, and assessing your fitness to continue practicing medicine here. The color drained from Dr. Carlson's face. Suspended? But my patients will be reassigned, Dr. Marsh said firmly. Dr. Carlson, I hope you use this time to reflect on your actions and the sacred oath you took when you became a doctor. We're here to heal, to help, to show compassion. What happened today was a grave departure from those principles. Next day, the hospital board gathered in the conference room, their faces etched with concern. The large oak table was littered with printouts of news articles and social media posts, all centered around the viral video of Dr. Carlson's dismissive behavior. Dr. Marsh, the chief administrator, stood at the head of the table. Ladies and gentlemen, we're facing a crisis, she began, her voice grave. The phones haven't stopped ringing since that video went viral. We've got patients calling to cancel appointments, journalists demanding statements, and even local officials asking for explanations. The room buzzed with worried murmurs. Dr. Jenkins, a senior board member, spoke up. What are our options here? We need to act fast to contain this PR nightmare. Dr. Marsh nodded. I've already suspended Dr. Carlson pending an investigation, but we need to do more. I propose we launch a full internal investigation into this incident and Dr. Carlson's past behavior. The board members nodded in agreement. Dr. Patel, another board member, added, We should also issue a public statement. We need to show that we're taking this seriously and that patient care is our top priority. As the board discussed the details of their response, word of Dr. Carlson's suspension spread through the hospital. In the doctor's lounge, a heated debate was brewing. Dr. Rodriguez, a young resident, shook her head in disbelief. I can't believe Dr. Carlson would do something like that. He's always been so efficient. Dr. Thompson, an older nurse practitioner, sighed. Efficient, yes. But caring? Not so much. I've had concerns about his bedside manner for years. But he's one of our best diagnosticians, Dr. Lee argued. Surely that counts for something. Not when it puts patients at risk, Dr. Williams countered. I've seen him dismiss patients before, especially those from underprivileged backgrounds. This incident was just waiting to happen. The conversation was interrupted by Dr. Marsh, who entered the lounge with a grim expression. I know you've all heard about what happened, she began. I want to assure you that we're taking this very seriously. We'll be conducting a thorough investigation and we ask for your cooperation during this process. The room fell silent as the gravity of the situation sank in. Dr. Marsh continued. We'll also be reviewing our policies and procedures to ensure nothing like this happens again. If any of you have concerns or observations about Dr. Carlson's past behavior, please don't hesitate to come forward. As Dr. Marsh left, the room erupted into hushed conversations. Some defended Dr. Carlson, citing his years of service and medical expertise. Others expressed relief that long-standing issues were finally being addressed. The hospital staff was clearly divided, mirroring the turmoil that was unfolding beyond the hospital walls. That night, Dr. Carlson pulled into his driveway, his shoulders heavy with the weight of the day's events. As he stepped out of his car, he noticed the curtains of his neighbor's house quickly closing. A knot formed in his stomach. News had already spread to his quiet suburban street. He walked into his house expecting the usual warm greetings from his family. Instead, he was met with an eerie silence. Karen, his wife of 20 years, sat at the kitchen table, her face pale and drawn. Their two teenage children, Emily and Michael, were nowhere to be seen. Karen? Dr. Carlson called out softly, his voice filled with uncertainty. Karen looked up, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. "John, it's everywhere," she whispered. "The video, your suspension. Everyone knows." Dr. Carlson's heart sank. He hadn't considered how this would affect his family. "I'm so sorry," he said, reaching for her hand. Karen pulled away. "I was approached by my coworkers today. They asked if I knew I was married to a heartless doctor. Some of them wouldn't even look me in the eye." Dr. Carlson felt a wave of guilt wash over him. "Where are the kids?" he asked, dreading the answer. "In their rooms," Karen replied. "Emily came home crying. Some girls at school were calling her father a racist doctor. Michael got into a fight defending you." Just then, Emily appeared in the doorway, her eyes puffy from crying. "Dad?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is it true? Did you really turn away a sick kid?" Dr. Carlson felt his world crumbling around him. He had always prided himself on being a good father, but now he saw the pain in his daughter's eyes. "Emily, it's complicated," he began, but she turned and ran back to her room. Michael came downstairs, his face set in a scowl. "Thanks, Dad," he spat out. "Now everyone at school thinks we're some kind of monster family." Dr. Carlson watched helplessly as his son stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the silent home, a stark reminder of how quickly his life had unraveled. Karen stood up, her voice trembling. "John, what were you thinking? How could you let this happen?" For the first time, Dr. Carlson truly began to understand the far-reaching consequences of his actions. It wasn't just his career at stake. It was his family's well-being, their reputation, their peace of mind. The realization hit him like a physical blow, leaving him breathless. I didn't think," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "I never meant for any of this to happen." As he looked around at his fractured home, Dr. Carlson realized that the repercussions of his behavior extended far beyond the walls of the hospital. His family was suffering because of his actions, and he had no idea how to make it right. After a few days, as the hospital's internal investigation into Dr. Carlson's conduct deepened, a troubling pattern began to emerge. More and more staff members, particularly nurses, came forward with stories that painted a picture of long-standing bias and dismissive behavior. Jenny, a nurse who had witnessed the incident with Trevor, was one of the first to testify. She sat nervously in front of the hospital board, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "It wasn't just that day," Jenny explained, her voice trembling slightly. "Dr. Carlson has a habit of, well, not taking certain patients as seriously as others." The board members leaned in, their faces grave. "Can you give us an example?" one of them asked. Jenny nodded. "Just last month, a young woman came in with severe abdominal pain. She was from a low-income neighborhood. Dr. Carlson barely looked at her chart before suggesting it was probably just gas and telling her to go home. As Jenny's testimony concluded, more nurses stepped forward. Among them were several Black nurses who shared their own experiences with Dr. Carlson. Nurse Johnson, a veteran with 15 years of experience, recounted an incident that still made her blood boil. "I was assessing a patient with unusual symptoms," she said. "When I brought my concerns to Dr. Carlson, he laughed and said, 'Sweetie, leave the diagnosing to those of us who went to medical school.' It was humiliating." Another Black nurse, Lisa, shared a similar story. "Dr. Carlson constantly questioned my judgment," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "Once, when I insisted a patient needed immediate attention, he told me to stick to taking temperatures and walked away. The patient ended up having a severe infection that could have been caught earlier." As the testimonies continued, a clear picture formed of Dr. Carlson's behavior. It wasn't just about one incident or one patient. It was a systemic issue of bias and condescension that had gone unchecked for far too long. The board members exchanged troubled glances. What had started as an investigation into a single incident was quickly becoming something much larger and more deeply rooted in the hospital's culture. As the testimonies against Dr. Carlson mounted, he felt the walls closing in around him. His face grew red and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. How could they twist his actions like this? "This is ridiculous," Dr. Carlson burst out, interrupting the latest testimony. The board members turned to look at him, their expressions a mix of surprise and disapproval. "Dr. Carlson, please wait your turn," the head of the board said firmly. But Dr. Carlson couldn't hold back anymore. "You don't understand what it's like out there," he said, his voice rising. "We're understaffed, overworked, and expected to perform miracles every day. Of course, I have to make quick decisions." The room fell silent, all eyes on Dr. Carlson as he continued his defense. "Do you know how many patients we see in a day? How many life or death choices we have to make in seconds? I'm doing the best I can with what I have." One of the board members leaned forward, her eyes narrowed. "Dr. Carlson, we understand the pressures of emergency medicine, but these testimonies suggest a pattern of bias, not just isolated incidents due to stress." Dr. Carlson scoffed. "Bias? That's absurd. I treat all my patients equally." Just then, another nurse stepped forward. "With all due respect, Dr. Carlson, that's not true," she said softly. "I've seen you dismiss concerns from patients of color more times than I can count. It's not just about being busy or stressed, it's about who you choose to listen to." Dr. Carlson's face fell as he looked around the room. He saw no sympathy in the eyes staring back at him. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed his mind. Could they be right? Had he really been treating people differently without realizing it? The head of the board cleared his throat. "Dr. Carlson, in light of these testimonies, we believe this issue goes beyond the incident with young Trevor. We will be expanding the scope of our investigation to examine your overall conduct and its impact on patient care." Dr. Carlson felt the ground shift beneath his feet. This was no longer about one mistake or one bad day. His entire career, everything he'd worked for, was now under scrutiny. As he left the meeting room, Dr. Carlson's mind raced. He'd always prided himself on being a good doctor, on saving lives. But now, faced with story after story of patients and colleagues he'd hurt or dismissed, he began to wonder if he'd been blind to his own actions all along. As the days passed, more stories began to surface about Dr. Carlson's dismissive treatment of patients. Social media platforms buzzed with accounts from former patients, each one adding to the growing picture of a doctor who seemed to care more about efficiency than empathy. One woman shared her experience of being rushed through an exam despite her concerns about chest pain. "Dr. Carlson barely looked at me," she wrote. "He said it was probably just anxiety and sent me home. 2 days later, I was back in the ER with a heart attack." Another patient, a young man from a low-income neighborhood, described how Dr. Carlson had accused him of drug-seeking when he came in with severe abdominal pain. "I ended up having appendicitis," he said. "If I had listened to Dr. Carlson and gone home, who knows what could have happened." These stories, combined with the testimonies from the nurses, cast a dark shadow over St. Mary's Hospital. The public's trust in the institution began to erode rapidly. Local news stations picked up the story, running nightly segments featuring interviews with former patients and their families. Headlines screamed accusations of systemic bias and negligence. The hospital's phone lines were flooded with angry callers demanding action. The backlash didn't stop at angry phone calls. The hospital's charitable programs, which relied heavily on community support, saw a sharp decline in donations. Several prominent donors, concerned about being associated with the scandal, quietly withdrew their support. Martha Johnson, a longtime benefactor of the hospital's children's wing, issued a public statement explaining her decision to pull funding. "I cannot, in good conscience, continue to support an institution that allows such blatant disregard for patient care," she said. "Until St. Mary's takes concrete steps to address this issue, I will be redirecting my charitable giving elsewhere." The hospital board found themselves in crisis mode. Emergency meetings were called daily as they struggled to contain the fallout. The chief administrator, looking haggard and sleep-deprived, faced a barrage of questions from reporters camped outside the hospital. "We are taking these allegations very seriously," he said, his voice strained. "A thorough investigation is underway, and we are committed to making whatever changes are necessary to ensure that every patient receives the highest standard of care." regardless of their background. But for many, these words rang hollow. Protesters began to gather outside the hospital, holding signs that read, "Black Lives Matter in Healthcare Too," and "Justice for Trevor." The once respected institution now found itself at the center of a national conversation about racial bias in medicine. As the pressure mounted, the board realized that simply suspending Dr. Carlson might not be enough to quell the public's anger. They needed to take stronger action, and fast, before the damage to the hospital's reputation became irreparable. The hospital board convened in a somber atmosphere, the weight of their decision hanging heavy in the air. After hours of intense deliberation, they reached a unanimous conclusion. Dr. Carlson's medical license would be provisionally revoked, and he would be dismissed from St. Mary's Hospital pending the final results of the investigation. The chief administrator, his face etched with lines of stress, made the call to Dr. Carlson. His voice was steady but filled with regret as he delivered the news. Dr. Carlson felt the world crumble around him as he listened to the words that would change his life forever. He had been clinging to a sliver of hope that he might return to work, that this nightmare would somehow blow over. But now that hope was shattered. I understand," he managed to choke out, his voice barely above a whisper. As he hung up the phone, the reality of the situation crashed over him like a tidal wave. He stumbled into the living room where Karen sat anxiously waiting. One look at his face told her everything she needed to know. She rushed to his side, wrapping her arms around him as he collapsed onto the couch. "They've revoked my license, Karen," he said, his voice hollow. I'm not a doctor anymore." Karen held him tighter, her own tears falling silently. Their whole world had been built around Dr. Carlson's career. Now, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. The news spread quickly. Local media outlets ran breaking news alerts, and social media exploded with reactions. Many celebrated the decision, seeing it as a step towards justice and accountability in healthcare. Others, particularly some of Dr. Carlson's longtime colleagues, expressed shock and dismay. At St. Mary's, the atmosphere was tense. Nurses and doctors gathered in small groups, discussing the news in hushed tones. Some felt relieved, hoping this would lead to positive changes in the hospital culture. Others worried about the implications for their own practices. Jenny, the nurse who had testified about Dr. Carlson's behavior, felt a mix of vindication and sadness. "It's not about punishing one person," she told a coworker. "It's about making sure all patients get the care they deserve." As night fell, Dr. Carlson sat alone in his study, staring at the wall of medical diplomas and awards that now seemed to mock him. He thought about all the years of study, the long nights of residency, the countless patients he had treated. Had it all been for nothing? For the first time, he allowed himself to truly reflect on his actions. The faces of patients he had dismissed, including little Trevor, flashed through his mind. A sense of shame washed over him, followed by a crushing wave of regret. Trevor sat up in his bed at home, his bright eyes scanning the colorful Get Well cards scattered on his nightstand. He was feeling much better now, thanks to the care he received at the hospital. His Aunt Marla bustled around the room, adjusting his pillows and fussing over him. "How are you feeling, sweetie?" Marla asked, her voice filled with concern and love. Trevor smiled weakly. "I'm okay, Aunt Marla. My head doesn't hurt as much anymore." Marla's eyes welled up with tears of relief. "I'm so glad, honey. That doctor who helped you was amazing. I can't thank her enough." Meanwhile, across town, Dr. Carlson paced in his living room, his world crumbling around him. The weight of his actions pressed down on him like a heavy blanket. He felt a whirlwind of emotions, anger at the situation, despair over losing his career, and a growing sense of guilt that gnawed at his insides. He stopped by the mantel, picking up a framed photo of himself in his white coat, smiling proudly. Now that image felt like a stranger. "How did I let this happen?" he whispered to himself, his voice cracking. Karen watched her husband from the doorway, her heart aching. She wanted to comfort him, but she felt torn. The backlash against their family had been intense. Just yesterday, she had to delete their social media accounts because of the flood of hateful messages. "John," she said softly, stepping into the room, "maybe we should talk about what happened." Dr. Carlson turned to her, his eyes red-rimmed. "What's there to talk about? My career is over. Everything I've worked for, gone." Karen took a deep breath. "I know it's hard, but have you thought about why this happened? About Trevor and the other patients?" Her words hit Dr. Carlson like a punch to the gut. Images of Trevor's scared face flashed through his mind, along with the faces of countless other patients he had dismissed over the years. The guilt intensified, making it hard to breathe. I didn't mean to hurt anyone," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was just trying to do my job." Karen moved closer, wanting to comfort him but feeling a distance between them she'd never experienced before. "I know, John. But maybe it's time to think about how we can make this right." Dr. Carlson looked at her, seeing the strain in her eyes, the worry lines that hadn't been there before. He realized with a start that his actions had affected not just his patients, but his family too. The guilt threatened to overwhelm him. "I don't know how," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I don't know how to fix this." Dr. Carlson's world continued to crumble around him. Just when he thought things couldn't get worse, a stack of legal papers arrived at his doorstep. His hands shook as he read through the documents, each page feeling heavier than the last. Former patients. Discriminatory treatment. Lawsuits, he muttered, his voice barely audible in the empty house. The silence that followed was deafening. Dr. Carlson slumped onto the couch, his head in his hands. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, threatening to crush his spirit entirely. As days turned into weeks, the stress of the legal battles took its toll. Dr. Carlson's once pristine home office became a cluttered mess of legal documents and unpaid bills. His savings, once substantial, dwindled rapidly as he struggled to keep up with mounting legal fees. One evening, as he sat at the kitchen table surrounded by papers, he overheard his children talking in hushed tones. "I can't take it anymore," his daughter Emily whispered. "Everyone at school keeps asking about Dad. It's so embarrassing." His son Jake's voice was filled with hurt. "I know, I wish we could just disappear." Dr. Carlson's heart sank. He wanted to go to them, to explain, to make things right. But as he stood up, he heard their footsteps retreating, doors closing softly. The next morning he found Karen in the kitchen packing lunches. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her movements mechanical. "Karen," he started, his voice hoarse. She cut him off with a look. "John, I think it's best if the kids and I stay with my sister for a while. We all need some space to process this." Dr. Carlson felt as if the floor had dropped out from under him. "For how long?" he asked, dreading the answer. Karen zipped up the last lunchbox. "I don't know," she said softly. Until we figure things out." He watched helplessly as Karen gathered the kids and their bags. Emily and Jake avoided his gaze, their shoulders hunched as if carrying invisible burdens. As the front door closed behind them, the silence in the house became oppressive. Dr. Carlson stood in the empty kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of his family's hasty departure. A half-empty coffee mug, a forgotten textbook, a family photo on the fridge that now seemed to mock him. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He was alone. Dr. Carlson paced his empty living room, the silence broken only by the sound of his footsteps on the hardwood floor. His mind raced, desperately seeking a way to make things right. Suddenly, a thought struck him. Jenny, the nurse who had testified against him. Maybe she could help him understand where he went wrong. With shaking hands, he dialed her number. Each ring felt like an eternity until finally, Jenny's cautious voice answered. "Dr. Carlson?" she said, surprise evident in her tone. "Jenny, I need your help," he stammered. "I want to make things right, but I don't know how. Can we meet?" There was a long pause on the other end. Dr. Carlson held his breath, waiting for her response. "Okay," Jenny finally said, her voice laced with skepticism. "But I'm not sure what good it will do." They agreed to meet at a small coffee shop the next day. As Dr. Carlson walked in, he spotted Jenny sitting in a corner booth, her eyes wary as she watched him approach. "Thank you for meeting me," he said, sliding into the seat across from her. Jenny nodded, her expression guarded. "What exactly do you want from me, Dr. Carlson?" He took a deep breath. "I want to know how I can start making things right. I've made so many mistakes, hurt so many people. I need to do something, but I don't know where to begin." Jenny studied him for a moment, her eyes searching his face. Finally, she sighed. "Dr. Carlson, the issues here go beyond just you. There are systemic problems in our healthcare system that needs to be addressed." She leaned forward, her voice passionate. "We need real change. It's not just about individual actions, but about creating a system that treats everyone fairly, regardless of their background or circumstances." Dr. Carlson listened intently, feeling a mix of shame and determination. "How can I help make that happen?" he asked. Jenny's expression softened slightly. "Well, for starters, you could use your experience to advocate for better training on cultural competence and bias recognition in healthcare. You could speak out about the pressures that lead to rushed judgments and dismissive behavior." As Jenny continued to explain, Dr. Carlson felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could turn this terrible situation into something positive. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of purpose. Dr. Carlson left the coffee shop with a newfound sense of purpose. Jenny's words echoed in his mind, sparking an idea that grew stronger with each passing moment. He realized that his mistakes, painful as they were, could become a catalyst for change. With trembling fingers, he dialed the number of Reverend Jackson, a respected community leader known for his work in social justice. The phone rang several times before a deep, resonant voice answered. "Reverend Jackson, this is Dr. Carlson. I need your advice." There was a pause on the other end. "Dr. Carlson? I must say, I'm surprised to hear from you." Dr. Carlson swallowed hard. "I understand, sir. I've made terrible mistakes, but I want to make things right. I was hoping we could meet to discuss how I might advocate for healthcare reform." The silence that followed felt endless. Finally, Reverend Jackson spoke, his tone cautious but not unkind. "I appreciate your willingness to address these issues, Dr. Carlson. Let's meet tomorrow at my office." The next day, Dr. Carlson found himself sitting across from Reverend Jackson, nervously explaining his ideas. The Reverend listened intently, his expression unreadable. "Your intentions seem genuine, Dr. Carlson," Reverend Jackson said when he finished. "But you must understand, many in our community are still hurt and angry. It won't be easy." Dr. Carlson nodded, his heart heavy. "I know, sir, but I have to try. I have a responsibility to address the harm I've caused." Encouraged by Reverend Jackson's willingness to listen, Dr. Carlson reached out to other community leaders. Some, like Ms. Rodriguez from the local Hispanic Community Center, were skeptical but willing to hear him out. Others, like Mr. Thompson from the NACP, were more hesitant. "Why should we trust you now?" Mr. Thompson asked bluntly during their meeting. Dr. Carlson felt the sting of those words, but he knew they were fair. "You shouldn't," he admitted. "Not yet, but I'm asking for a chance to prove that I've changed, that I want to be part of the solution." Despite the mixed reactions, Dr. Carlson felt determined to move forward with his plans. He began drafting proposals for improved cultural competency training in hospitals and clinics. He researched statistics on healthcare disparities, his heart breaking as he realized the full extent of the problem he had been part of. As word spread about Dr. Carlson's efforts, public opinion remained divided. Some saw his actions as a genuine attempt at redemption, while others viewed it as a ploy to salvage his reputation. But Dr. Carlson pressed on, knowing that the path to real change would be long and difficult. Next morning, Dr. Carlson took a deep breath as he entered the community center. The room was packed, with people from all walks of life gathered for the forum on healthcare disparities. His heart raced as he made his way to the front, feeling the weight of countless eyes upon him. As he took his seat on the panel, a hush fell over the crowd. The moderator, a local activist named Maria, introduced him with a hint of skepticism in her voice. Our next speaker is Dr. Carlson, who has a unique perspective to share. Dr. Carlson stood, his hands shaking slightly as he gripped the podium. "Thank you for allowing me to be here today," he began, his voice wavering. "I'm here to share my story, but more importantly, to listen and learn from all of you." He took a deep breath and continued. "For years I was part of the problem. I let my biases and assumptions guide my actions as a doctor. I failed to see the humanity in every patient who came through my doors." As he spoke about his mistakes, including the incident with Trevor, murmurs rippled through the audience. Some faces showed anger, others disbelief. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness," Dr. Carlson said, his voice growing stronger. "I'm here because I believe that by sharing my failings, we can work together to create real change in our healthcare system." When he finished speaking, the room erupted into a mix of applause and angry shouts. Maria opened the floor for questions, and hands shot up across the room. A woman in the front row stood up, her eyes blazing. "How do we know this isn't just a PR stunt to save your reputation?" she demanded. Dr. Carlson felt the sting of her words, but nodded. "That's a fair question," he admitted. "I can't prove my sincerity with words alone. All I can do is commit to this work day after day and hope that my actions will speak louder than any words could." Another attendee, an elderly man, spoke up. "I've been mistreated by doctors like you my whole life," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "What makes you think you can change an entire system?" Dr. Carlson listened intently, feeling the weight of the man's pain. "I don't think I can change the system alone," he responded softly. "But I believe that by working together, by listening to stories like yours and fighting for change, we can make a difference." As the forum continued, Dr. Carlson faced more tough questions and criticism. Some accused him of using the community's pain for his own benefit. Others shared heartbreaking stories of discrimination in healthcare, each one a stark reminder of the harm he had caused. Despite the harsh reception, Dr. Carlson remained committed. He listened to every story, took notes, and promised to use what he learned to push for concrete changes. As the forum came to a close, he felt exhausted but more determined than ever to continue on this path of advocacy and redemption. After a few days, as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the park, Marla sat rigidly on a bench, her eyes fixed on the path ahead. She spotted Dr. Carlson approaching, his steps hesitant and unsure. Her jaw clenched, a mixture of anger and determination etched on her face. Dr. Carlson reached the bench, his hands fidgeting nervously. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me, Marla," he said softly. Marla's gaze was steel. "Let's be clear, Dr. Carlson, I'm not here to forgive you. What happened to Trevor?" Her voice caught, and she took a deep breath. "It can't be undone. But I'm here because I see an opportunity for real change, and I won't let it slip away." Dr. Carlson nodded, his face solemn. "I understand. I'm here to listen and learn." Marla leaned forward, her eyes never leaving his face. "You want to make amends? Here's your chance. I challenge you to set up programs that support Black nurses. They've been overlooked and undervalued for far too long." Dr. Carlson's eyebrows rose, but he remained silent, listening intently. "And that's not all," Marla continued, her voice gaining strength. "I want you to create scholarships for underrepresented medical students. Give them the chance you tried to take away from Trevor and so many others." Dr. Carlson's shoulders straightened, a look of determination crossing his face. "I accept your challenge, Marla. It won't be easy, but it's necessary. I'll do everything in my power to make these programs a reality." Marla nodded, a flicker of approval in her eyes. "Good. But remember, this isn't about you feeling better about yourself. This is about creating real, lasting change in a system that's been broken for far too long." "I understand," Dr. Carlson replied, his voice steady. "This is just the beginning of a long journey. I'm committed to seeing it through, no matter how difficult it gets." As they continued to discuss the details of the programs, the tension between them eased slightly. Though forgiveness was still a distant prospect, a fragile bridge of understanding began to form. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the park, Dr. Carlson watched Marla's retreating figure. Her words echoed in his mind, leaving him feeling both challenged and deeply remorseful. He slumped onto the bench, his head in his hands, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a heavy blanket. The park slowly emptied, but Dr. Carlson remained, lost in thought. He replayed the events that had led him to this moment, his dismissive attitude, the consequences for Trevor, the pain he'd caused so many. Each memory was a sharp jab to his conscience. As darkness fell, he finally stood up, his legs stiff from sitting for so long. He walked slowly towards his car, dreading the return to an empty house. The silence that greeted him as he opened the front door was deafening. No laughter from his children, no warm welcome from Karen, just emptiness. Dr. Carlson wandered from room to room, pausing at family photos that now seemed to mock him. In the kitchen, a calendar on the fridge caught his eye. Circled in red was his daughter's upcoming dance recital, an event he would likely miss now. He sank into his favorite armchair, feeling more lost than ever. The house that once brought him comfort now felt like a prison of his own making. He picked up his phone, hoping for a message from Karen or the kids, but the screen remained blank. The consequences of his actions hit him anew. Not only had he jeopardized his career and reputation, but he'd also put his family through unimaginable stress. He thought of his children facing bullies at school, of Karen dealing with whispers and stares at work. The guilt was overwhelming. As the night wore on, Dr. Carlson's thoughts turned to Marla's challenge. It felt like a lifeline in a sea of despair. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but it gave him a sense of purpose. He reached for a notepad and began jotting down ideas for the programs Marla had suggested. Working late into the night, Dr. Carlson felt a mix of determination and deep sadness. He was committed to making these changes, to addressing the systemic issues in healthcare. But as he glanced at the empty house around him, he couldn't help but wonder if it was too late to save what mattered most: his family. The courthouse buzzed with tension as Dr. Carlson entered, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his actions. The room was packed with familiar faces, former patients, colleagues, and members of the community he had once served. As he made his way to the front, he could feel their eyes on him, some filled with anger, others with disappointment. The judge called the court to order and the proceedings began. Dr. Carlson listened as the plaintiff's lawyer presented their case, detailing instances of negligence and discrimination. Each story felt like a knife to his heart, reminding him of the pain he had caused. When it was his turn to speak, Dr. Carlson stood slowly, his hands shaking slightly as he gripped the podium. He took a deep breath and began. "Your Honor, and to everyone present here today, I stand before you not to make excuses but to acknowledge my mistakes," he said, his voice trembling. "I failed in my duty as a doctor and as a human being. I let my biases cloud my judgment, and in doing so, I caused immeasurable harm." He paused, looking around the room. Some faces remained hard, while others softened slightly. "I know that words alone cannot undo the damage I've done," he continued. "That's why I've been working to make real, tangible changes. I've established a fund in Trevor's name to promote cultural competency training in medical schools and hospitals. I'm collaborating with local healthcare organizations to develop curricula that address racial bias in medical care." As he spoke about his efforts, Dr. Carlson noticed a mix of reactions in the courtroom. Some nodded approvingly, while others crossed their arms, unconvinced. "I understand that these actions may seem too little, too late for many of you," he admitted. "And you're right to be skeptical. I can't change the past, but I'm committed to doing everything in my power to create a better future in healthcare." When Dr. Carlson finished his statement, the courtroom fell silent. The judge then invited responses from the plaintiffs. One by one, they stood to speak. A middle-aged woman named Lisa, who had been one of Dr. Carlson's patients, spoke first. "I appreciate Dr. Carlson's efforts," she said, her voice wavering. "It's a start, but it doesn't erase the pain and suffering many of us endured." Others were less forgiving. James, a former colleague, stood up angrily. "Words and promises aren't enough," he declared. "Dr. Carlson should face harsher consequences for his actions." How many lives were affected before he finally realized his mistakes? The room erupted in murmurs of agreement and disagreement. The judge called for order, reminding everyone that the purpose of the hearing was to gather information, not to pass judgment yet. As the proceedings continued, Dr. Carlson sat quietly, listening to each testimony. He could see that while some were open to his efforts at redemption, others remained deeply hurt and skeptical. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but he knew it was a journey he had to make. Days turned into weeks. Dr. Carlson's journey of redemption continued as he immersed himself deeper into advocacy work. He attended more community events, each one a small step towards making amends. At these gatherings, he listened intently to the stories of those affected by healthcare disparities, his heart heavy with the weight of his past actions. One sunny Saturday morning, Dr. Carlson arrived early at the local community center for a health fair. He wore a simple volunteer t-shirt, blending in with the other helpers. As he unloaded boxes of pamphlets and medical supplies, he caught sight of a few familiar faces from the hospital. Some nodded politely, while others looked away. "Where do you want these blood pressure cuffs, Dr. Carlson?" asked Jenny, the nurse who had testified against him. Her tone was neutral, but her eyes held a hint of curiosity. "Over by the screening area, please," he replied softly. "And Jenny, thank you for being here." As the fair got underway, Dr. Carlson found himself assisting with patient screenings. He worked quietly, checking blood pressures and explaining test results to community members. Many didn't recognize him, and those who did often hesitated before approaching his station. During a lull, Dr. Carlson overheard a conversation between two young medical students volunteering at the fair. "I can't believe they let him volunteer here," whispered one. "I heard he's been trying to make changes," the other replied. "Maybe he's really trying to do better." Dr. Carlson felt a mix of shame and hope wash over him. He knew his presence might make some uncomfortable, but he was determined to keep working, to keep trying. As the day wore on, Dr. Carlson found himself engaged in a conversation with Dr. Martinez, a respected physician from another hospital. "You know, Carlson," Dr. Martinez said, "what happened was terrible, but I've been watching your efforts. It takes guts to face your mistakes head-on like this." Dr. Carlson nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I'm just trying to do what's right, even if it's too late for some." As the fair wound down, Dr. Carlson helped pack up the booths. He felt a small sense of accomplishment, not from any recognition or praise, but from the knowledge that he had contributed to something positive. It wasn't forgiveness, and it might never be, but it was a step in the right direction. Dr. Carlson's persistent efforts in advocacy and community service slowly began to gain recognition. His sincerity and dedication to making amends started to resonate with some members of the community. Though skepticism remained, there was a growing sense that his actions were more than just a public relations stunt. One crisp autumn morning, Dr. Carlson gathered the courage to reach out to Marla, Trevor's aunt. With a trembling voice, he asked if it would be possible to meet with Trevor and apologize in person. After a long pause, Marla agreed, but with clear hesitation in her voice. A few days later, Dr. Carlson found himself sitting in a small, quiet room at a local community center. His heart raced as he waited for Trevor and Marla to arrive. When the door opened, he stood up, his hands clammy with nervousness. Trevor walked in looking taller than Dr. Carlson remembered. The boy's eyes were cautious but not unkind. Marla followed close behind, her protective stance evident. "Hello, Trevor," Dr. Carlson said softly. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." Trevor nodded silently, taking a seat across from Dr. Carlson. Marla stood nearby, her arms crossed. Dr. Carlson took a deep breath. "Trevor, I want to apologize for what happened that day at the hospital. I made a terrible mistake and you suffered because of it. I was wrong, and I'm truly sorry." Trevor listened quietly, his young face serious. When Dr. Carlson finished speaking, the room fell silent for a moment. Then Trevor spoke. "Dr. Carlson, what you did really scared me. For a long time, I was afraid to go to doctors or hospitals." Dr. Carlson felt a lump form in his throat. "I understand, Trevor. and I'm so sorry for causing you that fear. Trevor continued, his voice steady. But my aunt taught me something important. She said that when people make mistakes, the brave thing to do is to try to fix them. And that's what you're doing, isn't it? Dr. Carlson nodded, unable to speak. I think that's really brave, Trevor said. It's hard to say sorry and mean it. I forgive you, Dr. Carlson, and I hope you keep helping people. Tears welled up in Dr. Carlson's eyes. He hadn't expected forgiveness, especially not from this young boy who had every right to be angry. Trevor's words, filled with wisdom beyond his years, touched something deep within Dr. Carlson's heart. Thank you, Trevor, Dr. Carlson managed to say, his voice choked with emotion. Your forgiveness means more than you know, and you've taught me an important lesson today about bravery and kindness. As Trevor and Marla prepared to leave, Dr. Carlson wiped his eyes, overwhelmed by the profound impact of this young boy's words. He realized that in his journey to make amends, he had found an unexpected teacher in Trevor, someone far younger but infinitely wiser in the ways of forgiveness and healing. Dr. Carlson's journey of self-reflection and advocacy continued, driven by a newfound determination to understand the root causes of his past biases. He knew that true change would come only through listening and learning from those who had experienced discrimination firsthand. One sunny afternoon, Dr. Carlson volunteered at a free health clinic in a low-income neighborhood. As he helped set up folding chairs and tables, he struck up a conversation with Nurse Rodriguez, a veteran healthcare worker with decades of experience. You know, Dr. Carlson, Nurse Rodriguez said as she arranged pamphlets on a table, I've seen a lot of changes in healthcare over the years, but some things stay the same. Dr. Carlson paused, giving her his full attention. What do you mean? Nurse Rodriguez sighed, her eyes reflecting years of frustration. The way some doctors treat us nurses of color. It's like they don't trust our judgment, no matter how much experience we have. Dr. Carlson felt a pang of guilt, remembering his own dismissive behavior in the past. I'm sorry you've had to deal with that, he said softly. Can you tell me more about your experiences? As they worked side by side, Nurse Rodriguez shared stories of subtle discrimination and outright dismissal she had faced throughout her career. Dr. Carlson listened intently, asking questions and absorbing every detail. Later that week, Dr. Carlson attended a community forum on healthcare disparities. He sat quietly in the back, notebook in hand, as speakers from various backgrounds shared their experiences with the healthcare system. A young black medical student named Marcus took the stage, his voice filled with passion. It's not just about individual actions, Marcus explained. It's about a system that's built on centuries of inequality. We need to address the root causes. Dr. Carlson scribbled notes furiously, feeling a mix of shame and determination. He realized how much he still had to learn. After the forum, Dr. Carlson approached Marcus. Thank you for your powerful words, he said. I'm trying to educate myself and make a difference. Would you be willing to talk more about your experiences? Marcus looked at Dr. Carlson skeptically at first, but saw sincerity in his eyes. Sure, he nodded. I'd be happy to share my perspective. Over the next few weeks, Dr. Carlson continued to volunteer at health clinics and community events. He worked tirelessly behind the scenes, setting up equipment, organizing files, and assisting wherever he could. Though he couldn't practice medicine, he found ways to contribute and support the healthcare workers on the front lines. During these volunteer sessions, Dr. Carlson sought out conversations with healthcare workers from diverse backgrounds. He listened to their stories, asked thoughtful questions, and took mental notes on how he could use his platform to amplify their voices. As he immersed himself in this work, Dr. Carlson felt a shift in his perspective. The more he learned, the more he realized how much work still needed to be done. His advocacy wasn't about seeking recognition or redemption anymore. It was about creating real, lasting change in a system that had failed too many people for too long. As the seasons changed, so did the atmosphere at St. Mary's Hospital. The institution had undergone a significant transformation, implementing new policies and training programs to address systemic biases and improve patient care for all. On a bright spring day, Trevor and his Aunt Marla walked through the hospital doors, not as patients, but as guests of honor. It was Trevor's 10th birthday, and the hospital staff had organized a small celebration to mark the occasion and the positive changes that had occurred since that fateful day in the emergency room. Trevor, now fully recovered and in good health, beamed as he entered the newly renovated pediatric ward. Colorful balloons and streamers decorated the hallways, and a banner reading, "Happy Birthday, Trevor," hung above the nurse's station. Marla squeezed Trevor's hand, her eyes glistening with tears of joy and relief. "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart," she whispered. "You've been so brave through all of this." As they walked through the ward, they noticed the diverse group of healthcare professionals working together seamlessly. Nurses and doctors of various backgrounds collaborated, their interactions marked by mutual respect and understanding. The hospital's chief administrator greeted them warmly. "Trevor, Marla, thank you for coming," she said. "Your experience has helped us create real change here. We're committed to providing the best care possible for every patient who walks through our doors." Trevor smiled shyly, overwhelmed by the attention but grateful for the positive outcome. As they gathered around a small table with a birthday cake, Trevor noticed a familiar face in the crowd. Dr. Carlson stood at the back of the room, a mix of emotions playing across his face. He had been invited to the celebration as part of his ongoing journey of reflection and redemption. His wife, Karen, stood beside him, her hand resting supportively on his arm. As Trevor blew out the candles on his cake, Dr. Carlson watched, his eyes filled with a combination of regret and hope. He thought back to that day in the emergency room, remembering how his actions had nearly cost Trevor his life. The weight of that realization had been a turning point in his life. With his family's unwavering support, Dr. Carlson had dedicated himself to advocating for change in the healthcare system. He had faced many challenges and setbacks, but the sight of Trevor, healthy and happy, reminded him why his efforts were so important. Karen leaned in close to her husband. "You've come a long way," she whispered. "We're all proud of the changes you've made." Dr. Carlson nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He knew he could never fully make up for his past mistakes, but he was committed to continuing his work to create a more equitable healthcare system for all. As the celebration continued, Trevor's laughter echoed through the ward, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of positive change. If you enjoyed the story of Dr. Carlson, Marla, and Trevor, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.